Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Dallas webinar. My name is Alastair Meiklejon, and you join me from the Lincolnshire Lockdown Loft. Today, believe it or not, is actually our 10th webinar, which is frankly unbelievable. So if you have been here with us from the beginning, thank you for your patience, not only today, but in the whole kind of grand scheme of things. We've obviously never done anything like this before, so it's a little bit kind of hit and miss sometimes. So thanks for sticking with us. So, now, today we were joined again by David Dallas, internationally regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on on old masters, and with decades of experience in authenticating works and advising clients. David, great to see you as always. Thank you for joining us. So tell us, where did you start your fantastic career in old masters?
I'm not sure I deserve all these plaudits, but I'm going to accept them with grace anyway. Thank you very much. When I was 18, I discovered that I failed to get into Oxford, and my A-levels were so bad that I wasn't going to be accepted anywhere else. I had to get a job, and my father was a friend of the managing director of Christie's, and I'd always liked paintings, so I went for an interview, and we chatted about this and that. And eventually he said, I understand you like paintings. What department would you like to go into, Impressionists or Old Masters? And I said, what are Old Masters? And he said, oh, they're all the early paintings. I said, oh, that's the one for me, sir. And he said, good, you start in September. Well, it isn't quite like that now. These days, you probably have to have a first in history from Oxford or Cambridge and be fluent in 2 foreign languages, preferably Mandarin and Russian. So I was very lucky. That's how I started. Almost by default.
No.
One thing I did though, as I went along, I discovered that I had, when I was young, an almost perfect visual memory, and that is a terrific tool for the trade, because so long as you look at lots of paintings in museums which you know are genuine, then you've got something in your memory bank to measure everything else you look at against, and it's a great aid if you do have a good memory, and I by fluke I did.
So, and through your career, obviously, David, you've worked in many different capacities through leading auction houses and advising private clients as well. Can you tell us anything about what you learned during those many years of working in those prestigious positions that you held?
Well, to begin with, when I was at Christie's, we had a huge volume of paintings. We probably looked at 100 paintings a week. And by the time I got into the department, I was 19. And the directors in the department were very scholarly people and quite generous with their help. There was Christopher Wood, who wrote the Dictionary of Victorian Paintings, William Austinone, who'd been a pupil of Berenson, and Gregory Martin, who'd come straight from the National Gallery, where he was a curator of Flemish paintings. And they gently, Gregory Martin in particular, who's a Rubens scholar, held you by the hand and he'd say, this is a landscape. Where were all the great landscapes in Holland painted? Haarlem. He'd say, quite right. And who were the painters who were most influential? He'd say the Ruysdaels or Hobben or whoever it was. Little by little, he'd lead you to making a correct attribution. So to work with, at a very young age, for these people who were very, very good at their job, got me started in understanding how to approach a painting.
I see. Now, David, where do we think that old masters are currently ranking? I mean, after decades of being at the forefront of the market, you know, from when you first started, where do you think they are now?
Well, they haven't accelerated in value as quickly as other things have. So 20th century classic and contemporary art has kind of leapfrogged them. When a great old master appears on the market, it still makes a very strong price, but they're in relatively small supply. So their market share has slipped because, I mean, someone like David Hockney, for instance, 300 have turned up in the last 25 years at auction. Can't say that of Rembrandt or Rubens or one of the great old masters. In terms of price, they're roughly similar, but you would have thought that because of the scarcity of the old masters, they might have pulled ahead of it. I mean, the most expensive work of art ever sold at auction is an old master painting. But we might come on to that later.
Yeah. I mean, as we come onto the subject, David, we might as well have a chat about it now. Probably the painting that quite clearly has caused the biggest stir, certainly I would say in the last decade, certainly with different opinions and people saying things and opinions flying about. I'll just see if we can actually bring up a photo of that for you, David. Bear with me 2 seconds, and I'll just see if we can show it for the ladies and gentlemen at home. And so, David, you should have an image of that there with you now.
I do indeed.
Fantastic.
Well, of course.
Tell us your view of the painting and your ideas surrounding it.
Well, I'm not a Leonardo scholar. It's a very esoteric part of the market, mostly because I think there are only 24 known paintings by him. You can see, even in this quite small illustration, that the hands and the orb are absolutely beautifully painted. And the bottom of the curls of Christ's hair, it's called Salvator Mundi. He's holding the orb which represents the world, and he's blessing it with his right hand. Well, the hands and the drapery are absolutely wonderful, but the face is slightly foggy. And my professional opinion is that this is a Leonardo da Vinci, but it's had some very insensitive cleaning done to the face in the past. So the flesh tones and the eyes, they lack the detail that you see in the hands. And that's because I think the paint has been so significantly abraded that it isn't really there. It was restored, I think, in New York, very subtly, but short of just redrawing the eyes, the eyebrows, the nose and the lips, you just have to slightly fudge the issue. And I think that's what's happened. And it has that slightly foggy appearance. And in contrast to the hands, I think it's very noticeable. Nevertheless, it's a fantastically rare thing.
Oh, I'm inclined to agree. I think neither am I a Leonardo scholar, but I think when you look at the image itself, I think as what you described as a slightly insensitive form of cleaning on it, you look at the facial definition and it appears to have almost lost latitude, if you see what I mean. There's something about it that isn't, as you quite rightly pointed out, if you look at the hands and the sphere, it's incredible. And the comparison is very clear.
Absolutely. I mean, it does look as though there's a misty cloud passing between the hand and the face that makes the whole thing blurry. But the thing, a painting is so rare, I don't think another one will ever come on the market, that it caused a huge amount of excitement when it came up.
And of course, the way it was marketed in terms of, did it go at an old master sale?
No, it didn't. The marketing at Christie's was very, very clever. They put it into a contemporary art sale on the premise that Leonardo is so important, so inventive, that he's completely ageless. There's no point containing him in the Renaissance. He's beyond that. He's an intellectual genius and a wizard with a paintbrush and pen and ink. He's a beautiful draftsman. Added to which, all the richest collectors seem to be in the contemporary game, so they put it into a contemporary sale, and it worked.
I was about to say.
Sorry, I was going to say, whether it was bought by somebody who collects contemporary art specifically, or it just drew attention because of what it is from all kinds of different areas, I don't know. There's debate about who actually owns it. It hasn't been seen since. It was meant to go to the Louvre for an exhibition, but it never happened.
No, it's been a fascinating way of a painting going through, being discovered and then being sold and then going through this entire kind of just change really in the way that things are actually sold. Because obviously when it was put through the sale, I think from what I understand, it was a case of, as you say, it's almost a timeless piece. It kind of crosses all borders, and the type of person that potentially wouldn't normally buy an old master potentially with that amount of money to spend on it, you know, it could be something that they might not even be an art collector, but looked at it from that point of view.
That's absolutely true. I mean, it's a one-off thing. It had so much press and publicity. You're buying something, well, I use the word iconic, but that is exactly what it is. It is a sort of Christian icon, isn't it?
By definition, exactly.
One of the most famous objects ever sold.
Well, let's come back to where we were there, David, and I can see you again now. So in terms of, we're looking at kind of slightly less well-known paintings, but still obviously in the higher echelons of old masters' paintings. I'll bring up some images now for us to talk about, and obviously your experience of these is phenomenal, and your knowledge of the actual paintings themselves. And just tell us a little bit about these and the way in which their current values have changed.
Well, this is a very interesting pair of pictures. They had a Rothschild provenance, and Rothschild, as I know you understand, Alice, is almost like a royal provenance. They were owned by Rothschild, and everything the Rothschilds owned was just the best possible taste, if I can say such a thing. These portraits were painted in 1634 in Amsterdam by Rembrandt, who had arrived in the city a few years earlier with his friend Jan Levens. They'd come from Leiden. And he had already, by the age of 28, established himself as the most sought-after painter, portrait painter in Amsterdam. And he was still keen to embellish his reputation. So he painted this very grand pair of portraits of Martin Sulmans and his wife, Opje Koppit. They're life-size, full length, and they're also in stunning condition. But what you get with them, you can't see it very clearly in images as small as these are. You get a fantastic sense of texture, the stiffness of the lace, the sheen on the black silk, her pearls and gold neck wearing. But they're absolutely brilliantly painted. I mean, these are masterpieces in the true sense. And Christie's brokered a very unusual deal. By French law, they had to be sold separately because they were bought by the Louvre and the Rijksmuseum together for 160 million euros. Not a small sum. But under French law, they had to do the laws of ownership. They had to be sold and priced individually. So they were priced at 80 million euros each. They will be shared by the Rijksmuseum and the Louvre. They'll never be separated. They'll always be hung as a pair. But they'll spend a year or two in the Louvre and then a year or two in the Rijksmuseum. But I think the French had to believe that they specifically own one. I don't know why that works. but they're masterpieces. I don't think such a big or glamorous Rembrandt will ever come to the market again.
It's an interesting subject, because I think you and I have touched on in the past, talking about why certain things have certain values. And I think when you look at the old masters market specifically, are the values down to the availability? I.e., we haven't really seen that many things come out of the woodwork. And is this why the value of them, I mean, it has gone up, obviously, and Salvatore Mundi is clearly on another level. But is it because there hasn't been the amount of incredibly high quality old masters coming to light? Because potentially we know where they all are.
Well, the number, of course, is dwindling because so many are bought by big museums, and they'll never come out of museums, or by particularly well-heeled collectors. And then occasionally big collections are broken up, but by and large, once they've left the market and gone into a museum or a great collection, they're never going to return to the market. And the dwindling supply makes it difficult to set out and choose a genre of old masters and collect it, because it's so sporadic, you don't get any sense of momentum. And it's probably impossible to do what was possible in the 19th century, when so many more things were available, and the American museums hadn't really started to get going. And they're very well endowed, the American museums, and since the war have collected so many masterpieces of European art.
Whilst we're in, I suppose a good question would be, so why are Dutch paintings still seem to be available then? Were there that many Dutch paintings done, and were there that many Dutch painters?
Yes, it's a very good question. The answer is that in what's called the Golden Age, the 17th century, Holland was a very, very rich country. They'd been at war until 1648 with the Treaty of Munster with Spain. But nevertheless, with their mercantile wealth, with outposts in Brazil, Indonesia, Moluccas, the Cape, they were trading in spices. They had a Baltic herring fleet. They were very, very rich. And every town had a guild of artists, which acted a bit like a livery company or a trades union, protecting the rights of the painters in that town. There were masters in the guild who had workshops and trained people, and everybody bought art. They estimate that between 1 million and 1.5 million paintings were produced in Holland in that century. And even illiterate farmers would come to town on market day, go to the pub afterwards, have a few drinks, and buy a painting of someone having a drink and playing skittles. People at one point thought that Vermeer owed money to the baker because the baker had 2 of his paintings in the window. That wasn't the case. The baker not only was a baker, but he traded in paintings. All kinds of people did as well. Everybody bought paintings. So the supply is, in that country, gigantic. Not a Rembrandt or someone like that, but in the top of the second division, there are a lot of very, very brilliant and desirable paintings. So you can collect Dutch paintings, make sense of it.
Let's have a quick look, David, at another picture that we were going to discuss, and let me just access that one now. Again, an absolute, no other word for it than a masterpiece, but let's have a look at this. And again, so much going on here. What's your kind of definition of what we're looking at?
Well, this is also, one has to describe it as a masterpiece. This is by Rubens, Flemish painter who was also the Spanish ambassador to the court of St. James, who's a diplomat as well as a painter. Had a huge workshop like Rembrandt, full of extremely able painters, producing things for the Medici, for Charles I, for a lot of royal, the Archduke of Austria. And this picture is the Massacre of the Innocents. You may remember that the Magi, on their way back from visiting, the wise men from visiting baby Jesus, are interviewed by Herod, and he asked them what they were doing. They said they'd been to see this child who will be king. So Herod sent out his troops to murder every firstborn male. And that's what's going on here. It's a very gruesome subject. He's managed to avoid too much, but you can see that this is a profoundly emotional and tragic event that's unfolding. One of Rubens' many skills, he's a beautiful draftsman, is to compose a multi-figure composition like this and it to sort of make sense. He has designed it in such a way that the eye is drawn to the central figure who's trying to scratch the eyes of the man who's grabbed her baby, whilst her mother is about to be stabbed by another soldier. And if you look from the sort of left-hand corner running down, there's a sloping roof, then there's the angle of the sword as it goes towards the old man, and then the baby's leg, and a further baby's leg in the bottom right-hand corner. Looking at the top right-hand corner, there's a baby about to be thrown to the ground, and the angle of him along with the central woman's right arm, and the angle of the old woman's body and the soldier's leg form a perfect cross. So without the viewer actually being conscious of it, you're drawn to the middle of the picture. The skin tone, always with those of the men is always much darker. They look as though they've been working in fields. So they're slightly more sunburnt, and the women are always paler. So in the centre is the sort of climax of the whole thing, the poor old woman being about to be stabbed, and the pale woman scratching the man's face. But what is so brilliant is that the left elbow of the pale woman in the red raiment looks as if it's jutting outside the picture plane. And just beyond her is the man bending forward with a sword. And the foreshortening of that creates the most wonderful sense of space. We're just looking at a two-dimensional panel. In this case, it's a very big panel. But he's created this incredible sense of movement, violence, space, and you're drawn to the center of it without even knowing what chicanery he's got up to make you look at it. It's in beautiful condition, and despite the subject matter, it's just a miracle of painting. Fabulous thing.
No, the incredible amount of action being depicted is phenomenal.
Oh, it's extraordinary, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, no, just stunning. I'm just actually looking at it now, David, just taking everything in that you said about obviously the way in which you are drawn to certain aspects of the painting.
Yeah. It came up at Sotheby's, and it made £49.8 million. Sotheby's in London. It was bought by Lord Thompson of Fleet, and it's now in the gallery in Ontario.
Comparatively a bit of a bargain, I would say, at that price.
I think it's a bit of a bargain too, but I'd like to have enough money in my back pocket to buy a £50 million painting and give it to my favourite museum.
Wouldn't we all, or just have a wall that's big enough for it, I should say.
Yes, quite.
David, we've got a couple of questions that have come in, and we'll keep this up because it's a nice image to look at whilst we're talking about this. So,
sure.
Question that's come in, it says, where do you think that the old masters market, rather, in the short, medium, and long term, is going to go post COVID-19?
Well, during the whole COVID thing, there was a sale at Sotheby's online, obviously, of paintings that were owned by Raphael Valls, the West End dealer. He consigned 100 paintings, and I winced at what might possibly happen to them, but the sale was an unqualified success. The first lot made 5 times the top estimate, and 98 out of 100 paintings sold. So,
which is a phenomenal rate.
It's a fantastic success rate. And the prices were very, very high. So I think that there's definitely a demand for the things, and I can only see that increasing. I think a lot of people will want to get back to normal as soon as possible, and buying things that are life-enhancing, or not that the Massacre of the Innocents is necessarily that, despite being a masterpiece. I think people will want to try and get back to the way it was before.
I thought for years now that we're almost overdue a renaissance of old masters paintings in terms of their popularity, maybe.
I would like to think so. Their big disadvantage is that they require, in order to fit them into a historical context, you do need to know sort of linear social history. You have to know about what was going on in the 17th, 16th, 18th centuries, what have you. And because of the kind of subject matter, you probably need to know the Bible quite well and understand classical mythology. Because apart from portraits, the subject pictures will be taken. And a picture like this, which almost falls into the bracket of a history painting, that was considered the highest form of art. So you do need to be au fait with classical mythology and Christianity in depth to make sense of what's going on in these pictures.
Do you think there might be a slight issue? Because a question that's come in is saying that Are there young collectors that are developing a passion for collecting old masters? Or do you think potentially the ecclesiastical nature of some of these things do have a slight hindrance on people actually approaching them for, for being collectible items?
Yes, it definitely does have an effect. I don't know too many young old master collectors. I know some in their 50s, but no, it's not really young man's taste. I believe there are some young collectors in Holland, people in their 30s, for argument's sake. You've got to have reached a certain stage of your career to be in a position to afford the thing. So that will apply to almost everything. So
yeah, it's a difficult scenario. I think thankfully in our line of work we have the ability to see some of these things firsthand on a regular basis, which is great. But so do you think dealers and galleries are kind of pushing their way to inspire new generations of people, not necessarily just young people, but just different people in terms of what they're buying? Obviously, the Salvatore Mundi, it was deemed to be that important that they could put it in a scenario that wasn't a traditional old master sale. So do you think that there is a push to kind of put these paintings out to more people?
I don't think there is, but I definitely think there should be a push, because there's so much of, civilization is embraced by these things. These are the culmination, the high point of, well, in this case, of 17th century Baroque art. Actually, in this specific case, this picture was painted around 1609-10. Rubens had just been to Rome, and he'd been looking at Caravaggio, which it has this rather dramatic light and shade. I think that what Sotheby's were doing perhaps 20 years ago in New York would be a very good idea, which is to have, they had a whole linear history of what was going on in Europe from, say, 1400 to 1800, with the paintings that they were about to sell, photographic reproductions of them, along the different timelines of the English Civil War, whatever it was, the Counter-Reformation in a case of something like this. So people could see how they fitted into a historic context, and they had lectures in the evening. And I think if you're not familiar with the subject matter and the painters, it's extremely helpful to have someone explaining what they all are. And I think old master dealers and auctioneers should do much more of that. They should have seminars and evening masterclasses when the things are on view. Why not?
It's raising the profile. Good museums, when it's been well documented in the past, when a museum has had a fantastic exhibition on a specific artist or a specific movement. I mean, old masters encapsulate such a broad sphere, but when it's something a little bit more specific, that the value in those paintings and the interest in those paintings goes through the roof, because obviously people are having the opportunity to learn about them. And I think learning about these images, I think is, as you quite rightly pointed out, it is such a different thing than looking at a piece of modern art, which may be not slightly easier, but I think in the way that people think, the mentality of people obviously is slightly more similar to a piece of art that was made in the 1950s, but a 17th century piece of art, the mentality of that artist was probably very, very different to that which we know these days. So I'm in total agreement with that, and think it could be something that a lot of people would look into. Now, in terms of the values of these, and this was something I was going to bring up a little bit later, but I think it's a good time to bring it up now. Do you think the confidence when people are buying these things is there at the moment? Because obviously you've probably seen this, and I certainly have seen it, where there have been paintings that are out there, and it can be good, and it could be for it could be better, it can be for worse, but sometimes things have been attributed and then later deemed to be incorrectly attributed. Does this happen very often?
Yeah, it does. I mean, scholarship is in a state of flux, and as well as connoisseurship, by which I mean, looking at things and making a stylistic judgment, I think science has improved a lot. So you can analyze the pigments, and there's another thing, is infrared reflectography, so you can look at the underdrawing and compare the underdrawing of this Rubens with another one. You know, and if they look identical, then you know that the surface is by the artist as well as the underdrawing. But all of those sort of things, I think, are very helpful and should give comfort to would-be purchasers. But you're right, scholarship develops and changes. And curiously enough, with this picture, this Rubens, and I think you've got another one that we're going to look at later, they obviously were known to be by Rubens when they were painted, and they were handed down and bought and sold and changed. But by the time we got to the mid-20th century, people had completely forgotten who they were by. Both this painting and Lot and his daughters that we're going to see, no one knew. This was, I think, attributed to Van der Hecker, who's one of Rubens's pupils. And I don't know about Lot and his daughters, which we'll see in a minute. They'd just been lost in the mist of time. It's just that old painting that we inherited. So it can go both ways. As far as fakes in old masters are concerned, we've had a few quite well publicized cases recently, but they're very, very rare. They're extremely difficult to fake convincingly. And we know so much about pigments and preparations of canvas and panel that you can rule out fakes pretty much. Fakes always get found out in the end. But
I think with fakes, perhaps it's not so much focusing on paintings that have specifically been designed to defraud, but what I'm talking about potentially are, for those of our viewers that aren't aware of schools of and manners of that, there can be sometimes some confusion over paintings that were produced in the school of an artist perhaps, and sometimes have been incorrectly attributed to the artist at the centre of the school.
Absolutely true. I mean, both Rembrandt and Rubens had more than a dozen assistants, all of whom went on to be masters in their own right. In case of Rubens, young Van Dyck worked with him, Jacob Jordan's, Snyder's, De Vos, a host of really, really good painters. And if you're looking at a big picture by Rubens, this is entirely by him, but some of those big cycles of paintings are worked on by lots of different people simultaneously. So it does make it very different. Yes, separating the master from the very able pupils, because after all, they are going to be painting in the style. Rubens's pupils will paint in his style because that's what they're asked to do. It's what they're familiar with. It's only when they've gone off on their own, they find their own voice. But to begin with, yes, it makes it very complicated.
Especially, as you say, not necessarily copying the style of the master. It must be yeah, very difficult for that kind of thing. David, I think in terms of screens and photographs that we've actually got, we've only got one more image, I'm afraid, and that's a Hockney piece, David, that you sent over. So let's have a little chat about this, because obviously not a very similar to the last few paintings that we've discussed. So tell us your view on this and why it plays an important part.
I must start by saying I am a fan of Hockney. I like his work enormously. But to play devil's advocate, if you compare this painting with the complexity of the Rubens we've just looked at, there's something very naive about it. There's something very attractive about it. I like the subject matter, but what he's done by the choice of the subject, the way where he's placed it, is to dodge the most complicated part of being a landscape painter, and that is to paint a middle distance that is plausible. He has got what pre-Renaissance painters always did, was to have a foreground and a distance. The landscape falls away, so you don't have to do that convincing meander from the front to the back to show how the eye got there, because you've got the two figures by the swimming pool in the foreground, and then just a long drop to a mountainous landscape behind. He's kind of dodged the issue.
The infinity pool hides a lot.
Yeah, I included it because it made $79 million, which I think is the most expensive work of art ever auctioned by a living artist. But, you know, I think if you convert the dollars into sterling, it's still more than any Rubens has ever made. And Rubens is one of the giants of 17th century painting.
So again, I suppose it kind of boils down to that question again of you know, where, you know, old masters rank in the whole kind of grand scheme of kind of sales in this day and age, when something like that will make 79 million. And let's not dismiss it, because it is a fantastically iconic painting. But when you look at the Rubens for the amount of money that it made, I'll say it again, it seems somewhat of a bargain for something that is such a monumental piece of work.
It's true, and I think what it tells you is that there are probably more people who want to own a Hockney than want to own a Rubens. It might just be as simple as that.
But is there a case, David, the fact that we obviously we see it with Hockney, we've seen it with certainly with Bacon, that there's been lots and lots of things that have recently come out of not necessarily the woodwork, but have actually come to sale. And it seems to me that they're more readily available, but still making more money, which seems a little bit bizarre given the scarcity of the old masters, that they're not making that kind of figure.
It is ironic, isn't it? I mean, Hockney acrylics, I think probably 300 have come up at an auction in the last 25 years, and Bacon, I think 40.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Made over 20 million in the last 13 years. I mean, they do, but that may be in their favour, that you can actually collect them.
Well, it's true. I mean, I'm not sure if you saw my webinar with Jonathan Horwich a couple of weeks ago talking about Lowry, and again, it's a really interesting subject that obviously people and the family, the couple that collected those Lowrys were obviously still enthralled by the prospect of collecting a living artist, because they knew that there were more to come almost. And I think that adds to it. With an old master, you're kind of limited because they've probably been dead for 300 years. So it's certainly an interesting kind of way of looking at it. David, we're running out of time on today's webinar, so I do have to thank you again for joining us. But can you tell us maybe about just one or two paintings that you've dealt with in your career that, you know, perhaps shocked or surprised you, or maybe kind of gave you a buzz that you've never had from a painting before?
Yes, there are several. One that shocked and surprised me for purely commercial reasons was going around a London sale room and hanging on the floor, but, you know, virtually floor level, was a view across the Stour Valley with Stratford St Mary Church and Dedham Church and Flatford Lock in the foreground. I thought to myself, was there only one person in the world who would have wanted to paint this, and it's John Constable. And indeed it was. And I bought it. It had a very, very strange sky. The sky was pink and quite horrible. And it took me 15 years to get around to cleaning it. Underneath the pink sky was in fact a grey stormy sky with two small holes in it. And somebody had repainted the entire sky, therefore completely corrupting the painting and making it not look like a constable. But in fact, it was a constable. That made my heart flutter quite a bit. And many, many years ago, I bought with two friends a huge picture at Christie's of Perseus with the head of Andromeda by Luca Giordano, who was known as Fa Presto, because he worked so fast. It was a massive 12-foot square painting. In fact, when the King of Spain was dying, Luca Giordano was called over from Naples to finish off the decorations because only he could work fast enough to get the thing done before the king croaked it. And I bought this wonderful painting, this bit like the Rubens in a way, very complicated multi-figure composition. And we sold it to the National Gallery, and you can see it there. Christie's actually dropped it, getting it off the wall, and tore the top edge of the canvas. So they waived the buyer's premium.
It's very, very, very generous.
Very decent of them.
David, I'm sure we could talk all day about more tales, but unfortunately we're out of time today. Thank you ever so much for joining us. I know it's been a bit of a hassle today. I think technology, unfortunately for all of us, hasn't been the easiest over this period, but we are still trying. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me today. We will be back next week, and we look forward to seeing you then. So thank you very much for joining us. And David, thank you ever so much for joining us as well.
My pleasure. I'm just so sorry to have kept you all waiting so long. Hope it was worth it.
I'm sure it was worth it. Thank you, David. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Goodbye now.
Bye, Alastair.